Welcome back. Well, almost exactly a year ago, when China launched a missile to destroy an inoperative satellite, another controversy blew up. The US State Department feared an escalation.
We certainly are concerned by any effort by any nation that would be geared towards developing weapons or other military activities in space. That's absolutely contrary to what our, again, policy is articulated by the White House.
But the Chinese denied being aggressive and dismissed any idea of space race.
I have no knowledge of the situation. We always and continue to support the peaceful use of space. We oppose using weapons in space. In the past, present or in the future, we do not take part in any kind of space arms race.
Joining us again, our guests in Moscow, space scientist Yuri Karash, in Washington, D.C., Teresa Hitchens, director of the Center for Defense Information, and in Cambridge, Colin Pillinger, a professor in planetary science at the Open University. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Pillinger, what makes the Russians and the Chinese skeptical of the new American move?
I'm not sure, and this is a good question for me, but I know a year ago the Chinese demonstrated their capability in this area. I'm sure that the Russians and the Americans have had the same capability for quite some time. I think the difference about the Chinese demonstration was it was a very much greater altitude. And I don't think there was a great deal of justification for shooting down a weather satellite in those circumstances. I think, however, now because this has happened, there is very much a suspicion that among people that other nations may wish to demonstrate this. Now, I think any escalation from any further nations beyond the US and Russia and China would actually be very concerning.
Exactly. Teresa, the intercept will definitely send a strong signal to the Russians and the Chinese that the Americans now have an edge in terms of space strategic weapons. What do we expect the Russians and the Chinese to do? More escalation?
Well, that's a good question, and in fact, that's the $60 million question. The problem is that the Russians and the Chinese have long suspected that the U.S. missile defense program was not actually about defense, but about building offensive weapons to control space. And the fact that the U.S. did use a missile defense interceptor, slightly modified with new software, to shoot down a satellite shows that their suspicions may have some merit. I think that that's going to give the militaries in both countries some cause for concern as the U.S. missile defense program continues, and I'm not sure what their reaction will be. It's my hope that people will come to their senses and realize that this type of destructive anti-satellite weapon does no one any good, and that perhaps people will be driven to the table now to have some discussions.
Mr. Yuri, last year the Americans were furious at the Russians, at the Chinese, when they launched a missile to intercept a weather satellite, and they said that would just lead to further tension in the world. Are we now going to see the Russians and the Chinese escalating their efforts in terms of the space arms race?
President Putin said a few days ago at the press conference that if somebody did something, Russia does not necessarily have to copy it. Well, as about Chinese test of its anti-satellite weapon and the US shooting down its own satellite, despite some superficial resemblance between the two acts, I believe there is also a profound difference. The Chinese really tested its anti-satellite weapon, while the United States probably killed two birds by one stone. First, they prevented, as I said earlier, a chemical bomb from falling into Earth, and second, they also probably tested some of its anti-satellite technologies.
But still, Mr. Yuri, we know this is a matter of national pride for the Chinese and for the Russians. We know the last 50 years of race between the three nations. Aren't we going to expect something, for example, from the Russians?
Well, I would say that a Russian space program is so robust, diversified, that Russians probably do not need to shoot any satellite in space to prove its space might.
Mr. Pillinger, in theory, nobody owns or can claim that he owns the space. Isn't this the right time to start talking about a new legislation that would deal with the new developing or the new emerging realities in the outer space?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Nobody owns our outer space in the same way as we have regulations about what you can and can't do on Antarctica, which are essentially territories which are shared amongst all the nations of the world. I think if anybody wants to demonstrate and something for national pride, I wish it would be some event that you know, we could all celebrate, such as putting men on the moon and China going to the moon and Russia going to Mars. If we could see that, that would be a superb demonstration of people's technology. I think, however, there needs to be some agreement over what can be done in the when there is an emergency. And I think this particular satellite was a danger. It was a hazard to other satellites, and it was a hazard to people on the Earth. It was a small hazard, but therefore the risk had to be mitigated. If something had gone wrong, then it would have been very, very serious.
But then, Teresa, on one hand, we have the Americans, the Chinese, the Russians cooperate in terms, for example, of the International Space Station. But when it comes to supremacy over the outer space, they don't want to cooperate. What's wrong? Mr. Reza, my question is to Mr. Reza.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. Well, obviously, there are two competing things going on here. On one hand, in the civil space program, the Russians and the United States have had a long-standing history of cooperation going back to Apollo. The Chinese, however, are not involved in the International Space Station, in fact, in part because the United States has not been interested in having them on board. At the same time, there's increasing military competition in space amongst all nations, all spacefaring powers, because over the last couple of decades, it's become apparent that if a military has the ability to use space, it can create an edge for itself in its actions on the ground.
Mr. Reza, I have to interrupt you now. Let me just ask Mr. Yuri, in less than 30 seconds, the Iranians said they will step up efforts to join the club of those who have supremacy over the space. Are we going to see more competition in the future?
Well, I don't think that Iranians, with as fast as they develop their space capabilities, can pose a real challenge either to Russia or to the United States. Now, well, as about future, I would say that there may be competition between probably United States, Russia, and China in the exploration of outer space. But as about Iranians, I think we have to wait probably a few more decades until they become a real space power, until they develop capabilities to launch human spacecraft into space.
Thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.